My brother leaned back in his chair and said it with a smile. She works the front desk at a staffing agency, he told my grandmother's estate attorney, loud enough that the phrase front desk carried the specific weight of a man who had spent decades sorting people into categories of worth. She has no financial background, no experience managing property, and frankly, this family has carried her long enough. Whatever the will says about split ownership, it isn't practical. It would destroy everything my grandmother built. The attorney, a careful, silver-haired man named Mr. Calloway who had handled my grandmother's legal affairs for 22 years, didn't respond right away. He looked down at the thick file in front of him. He turned one page, then another. He removed his reading glasses very slowly, set them on the mahogany table, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen directed my way in a professional setting, genuine, unguarded astonishment. Then he looked at my brother. "Mr. Ashford," he said carefully, "are you aware that the company holding the senior note on every property in your grandmother's estate is Ironwood Capital Partners, LLC? My brother's smile didn't disappear immediately. It took about 3 seconds, like a power outage working its way through a building floor by floor. "My name is Miriam. I'm 37 years old, and I just watched the man who changed my grandmother's locks and threw my belongings into a donation bin discover that the investment firm foreclosing on his entire inheritance is mine. Before I tell you how we got here, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you've ever been handed a number that was supposed to represent your worth, and understood immediately that the number said everything about the person giving it, and nothing about you. Hit like. This one is for you." But we didn't start in that conference room. We started 6 weeks earlier on a Tuesday night in October, when my brother poured himself a glass of my late grandmother's scotch, handed me a check for $5,000, and told me to be grateful. My grandmother, Loretta, had died quietly in late September, in the farmhouse she'd lived in for 41 years, a 19th-century property outside of Rhinebeck, New York, that she'd restored herself with the money she made running a small regional chain of inns across the Hudson Valley. She'd built those properties from nothing. A woman from rural Virginia who came north at 22 with $1,200 and a handwritten business plan, who spent 4 decades turning budget hospitality into something honest and profitable. She was the most financially disciplined person I had ever known. She was also the only person in my family who had ever looked at me like I might become something worth looking at. My brother Curtis had different opinions. Curtis was 43, the eldest, the capable one, the son my grandmother had trusted to manage Ashford Hospitality Group when she stepped back from daily operations 4 years ago. He wore good suits, drove a new truck every other year, and had spent the last 4 years treating the family business like a personal expense account while quietly leveraging every asset it held to cover a lifestyle that had no sustainable basis. I knew the exact numbers. I'd been watching his loan filings for 2 years. What Curtis did not know was that I had been watching anything at all. He believed I worked reception at a staffing agency in Poughkeepsie. That was what I had told the family. That was what I'd been saying for 6 years, ever since I stopped trying to earn their respect and decided to build something instead. The woman who greeted clients at Meridian Staffing was real. She clocked in at 8, answered the phones pleasantly, and went home at 5. She was also the same woman who, at 5:30 every morning before those shifts, managed the daily operations of Ironwood Capital Partners, a private equity firm I had built from a rented desk in a Kingston co-working space into a $17 million portfolio of distressed hospitality debt across 4 northeastern states. Curtis knew nothing about that on the night he called us to the farmhouse. He'd arranged the gathering the way he arranged everything, like a CEO addressing a quarterly review, him standing while everyone else sat. My sister-in-law Heather occupied the armchair across from me. She was 39, a pharmaceutical sales rep, put together in a way that communicated both taste and intention, a structured blazer, a statement necklace, her dark hair pulled back with the precision of someone who understood that appearance and authority were the same currency. She had the particular energy of a woman who had long ago decided that proximity to power was functionally equivalent to having it. Curtis didn't sit, he never sat down when he was performing. "I've been in discussions with Mr. Calloway," he began, holding the estate summary folder I recognized immediately. "Grandma's wishes were clear in spirit, but the legal framework is complicated. The Ashford hospitality properties are entangled with the operating business, and a split ownership structure across multiple parties would destroy the value she spent her life creating. He looked directly at me when he said multiple parties. I looked back at him and said nothing. Heather and I have decided, he continued, that the cleanest path forward is a full operational transfer to me as current managing director. In exchange for waiving your inheritance rights, you'll receive a cash settlement. He reached into the folder, crossed the room, and set an envelope on the cushion beside me, the way people place things in front of animals they don't expect to understand what they're receiving. I opened it. The check was for $5,000. Heather watched me read the number. She was trying not to smile, and she was losing. Curtis has been running these properties for 4 years, she said, in the warm, practiced tone of a person who has learned to make condescension sound like patience. He has the vendor relationships, the licenses, the operational knowledge. What would you realistically do with a 50% stake in 3 small inns and a farmhouse, Miriam? You'd have to leave your receptionist position just to manage the paperwork. She said receptionist position the way people say participation trophy. I turned the check over in my hands. The paper was heavy and cream-colored. A very nice check. You said 3 properties, I said to Curtis. Grandma had 4. He paused one beat too long. The Route 9 property is under restructuring. It's a separate situation. It's not relevant to the settlement. I set the check on the side table. I'll think about it, I said. Curtis blinked. That was not the answer he'd prepared for. He'd prepared for tears, or resistance he could roll over, or the quietly buzzing acceptance of someone who had been told what they were worth often enough to believe it. There's a formal reading scheduled in 2 weeks, he said, his voice dropping its performance warmth. Mr. Calloway needs the waiver signed before then. I heard you, I said. I said I'll think about it. I drove home on Route 9G with the heat on and the radio off, watching the October trees move in my headlights. I wasn't angry yet. Anger is loud, and what I felt was something much quieter than anger. I called Bernard when I got home. Bernard had been my primary legal counsel for 4 years. He was the only person outside of Ironwood's 2 partners who knew what I actually did for a living. They're moving fast, I told him. He wants the waiver signed before the formal reading. He's trying to get me out of the picture before anyone does a real look at the asset structure. Understood, Bernard said. One question. Does your brother know we completed the Ashford note acquisition last month? No, I said. A pause. Then he has no idea what he's walking into. None, I said. Do you want to accelerate the timeline or let him proceed to the formal reading blind? I thought about the $5,000 check sitting on my grandmother's antique side table. I thought about the way Heather had said receptionist position. Let him think he's already won, I said. Wait for the reading. 3 days later, I drove past the farmhouse on my way into town. Someone had replaced the front door hardware with a new keypad lock, the kind you program yourself. I'd had a key to that house since I was 9 years old. My phone rang 10 minutes later. A cousin calling to let me know that Curtis had spent the afternoon loading boxes from my old room into a truck. Winter clothes I'd stored there, books, accumulated pieces of the early years of my life, and driven them to a Goodwill in Poughkeepsie without a single phone call to me. My grandmother's handmade quilt, the yellow and white one she'd sewn herself, the one that had covered my bed in that room since I was 6 years old. Gone. I sat in my car at the edge of a gas station parking lot, and I allowed myself exactly 2 minutes to feel exactly what that felt like, the grief of it, and the smallness of it, and the very specific cruelty of someone who throws away what someone else loves because they've already decided it doesn't matter. Then I called Bernard back. Accelerate, I said. I want everything ready before the reading. What Curtis had constructed over 4 years of running Ashford Hospitality Group was the financial equivalent of a house of cards in a high wind, and I had been watching it sway for 24 months. The Route 9 property he'd dismissed as under restructuring was 9 months delinquent on its commercial mortgage. The flagship Rhinebeck Inn was carrying a revolving line of credit extended to its ceiling, secured against operating revenues that had declined 31% under his management. He'd missed the third quarter estimated tax payment on the Millbrook property. He had leveraged the business to sustain a lifestyle that included a leased Range Rover, a condo in Park City, and business expense reports that would make a forensic accountant's eyes water. Ironwood Capital Partners had purchased the primary note on all 4 Ashford hospitality properties 6 weeks prior, through a third-party acquisition channel with no visible connection to my name. The originating bank, a regional lender in Albany that had grown exhausted by Curtis's pattern of partial payments and restructuring requests, had sold the entire distressed package to us at 62 cents on the dollar. Curtis had received the standard servicer transfer notice. He had ignored it, the way people like Curtis always ignore that letter. When you hold the senior note on a property, you hold more of it than the person making payments ever did. You cannot inherit a house the bank owns more than you. The formal reading was on a Thursday morning at Mr. Calloway's office on Montgomery Street, a quiet space that smelled like reference books and professional discretion. I arrived early and sat in the waiting room in a blazer I'd bought specifically for this morning, not expensive in a way that announced itself, just right. Curtis and Heather arrived together on time. Curtis wore his best charcoal suit. Heather had upgraded to something with structured shoulders, the outfit of a woman who expected to leave this meeting with a 4-property estate. She didn't look at me when they walked in. Bernard arrived a minute later, unhurried, carrying his battered leather folio. He sat beside me, said good morning quietly, and opened his notes. Mr. Calloway entered and arranged his papers with the careful precision of a man who understood that the next 30 minutes would permanently alter at least one person's life in the room. He looked at each of us. He did not smile. Before I begin the reading of Loretta Ashford's will, he said, there's a matter I need to address that emerged during the estate's asset verification. The servicer records on the Ashford Hospitality commercial notes were updated 6 weeks ago, all 4 notes. He placed a document in the center of the table. The new note holder of record is an entity called Ironwood Capital Partners, LLC, headquartered in Kingston, New York. Heather frowned and leaned toward her husband. Curtis picked up the document, he read the name, then read it again. There's been a clerical error, he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was working visibly hard. We have a standing relationship with our lender. This is an administrative mix-up. It is not a mix-up, Mr. Calloway said. I verified the transfer documentation directly with both the originating bank and the county recorder's office. The transfer is fully executed and recorded. Who is Ironwood Capital Partners? Heather asked. Her voice had shed its warmth entirely. What was underneath it was considerably sharper. Mr. Calloway looked at her, then he looked at me. I'd invite Ms. Ashford to answer that directly, he said. The room went still. I had thought about this moment for 2 weeks, whether I wanted it to be dramatic or cold or something careful and precise. In the end, I decided to treat it the way I treated every significant business disclosure, simply, without performance. Ironwood Capital Partners is my company, I said. I founded it 6 years ago. We acquired distressed debt in the hospitality sector. We purchased your loan portfolio 6 weeks ago from Albany Regional, which had classified the accounts as non-performing. Heather's breath stopped. I could see it, a visible pause in the rise and fall of her chest. Curtis stared at me. The suit, the groomed composure, the posture of a man who had rehearsed this morning, all of it was still technically in place. But behind his eyes something had gone dark. You work the front desk, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the last handhold he had. Sometimes, I said, I'm also the managing partner of a $17 million private equity fund. I have been for 6 years. That's not, he stopped, started again, that's not possible. You don't have capital like that, you have nothing. I have the senior lien on your 4-property portfolio, I said, which means I own more of this estate than you do, regardless of what the will says. Curtis turned to Bernard as if noticing him for the first time. Who are you? I'm Ms. Ashford's attorney, Bernard said pleasantly. Good morning. Curtis stood up. His chair scraped back loudly. This is manufactured. You did this to undercut the estate settlement. You don't know anything about running a business, Miriam. You don't know anything about. The Route 9 property, I said, is 9 months behind on its mortgage. Your Rhinebeck line of credit is drawn to the limit. You missed the 3rd quarter tax payment on the Millbrook property. I have every document. I looked at Bernard. Bernard opened his folio and placed a neat stack of papers in the center of the table. Heather stood up. She hadn't meant to. It was the involuntary rising of someone whose floor has suddenly become unreliable. How did you obtain those records? She asked. Those are servicer records, I said. When you acquire the debt, you inherit the disclosure rights. It's standard. Curtis. She gripped her husband's arm. Her voice had gone very thin. What does this mean? Does this mean the estate doesn't transfer? He didn't answer. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not rage, exactly, and not grief. It was the look of a man discovering that the map he'd been using to navigate his entire life was drawn wrong. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. Even if Mr. Ashford were the sole beneficiary, he said carefully, he would be inheriting properties whose senior debt is held by Ironwood Capital. If Ironwood calls the notes, which they are entitled to do given the current delinquency status, the properties would transfer to Ironwood to satisfy the outstanding balance. In plain English, Bernard offered, Curtis would be inheriting the equity position beneath a note that represents more than 50% of assessed value. Under these circumstances, that equity is effectively negative. The room held its silence for a long moment. You can't take Grandma's properties, Curtis said finally. His voice had lost its register. It was quiet in a way I hadn't heard from him since we were children. She built those. You can't just, they're her life's work. I didn't take anything, I said. You borrowed against them and stopped making the payments. I purchased the obligation from the institution you stopped paying. The rest is determined by what happens next. Heather sat back down slowly. I watched her understand, piece by piece, that the future she had already begun decorating in her mind. The renovated farmhouse kitchen, the tax advantages of the estate transfer, the identity of a woman who had married well enough, was not available to her. Not in the form she had imagined it. We can get current on the payments, she said. Her voice had the quality of someone negotiating with weather. Whatever the arrears are, we can arrange. Curtis's primary business line of credit is at capacity, I said. His personal accounts are commingled with business expenses in a manner that creates significant tax exposure. The Park City condo is mortgaged through a separate LLC. Bernard has those filings as well. Heather looked at the stack of documents. Then she looked at her husband. It was a particular kind of look. The recalculation happening in real time, the very specific expression of someone discovering that the person they trusted with their financial future had been keeping the actual ledger in a different room entirely. You planned this from the beginning, Curtis said. You sat in that living room and you let me hand you that check and you already knew. Yes, I said. Why didn't you say something? You could have come to me. We could have. You changed the locks, I said. You threw my grandmother's quilt into a donation bin without calling me. You handed me a $5,000 check in her living room and told me to be grateful. I paused. I decided to let the paperwork make my case instead. Mr. Calloway opened the will then and read it in its entirety. My grandmother had left the estate split equally between Curtis and me. In the codicil, written in her own hand on a separate sheet, she had added a single line, Miriam will know what to do with the properties. She always has. Mr. Calloway read it in his even, professional voice. I pressed my fingers together under the table and kept my face still. Curtis heard it and said nothing. I don't believe he had anything left to say. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in January, I stood in the front room of the Rhinebeck farmhouse and watched a contractor remove the keypad lock Curtis had installed and reinstall the original hardware. My grandmother's quilt, which I had found at the Poughkeepsie Goodwill still folded in its bin, slightly wrong, was across the back of the couch where it belonged. Ashford Hospitality Group was under new operational management, reporting to Ironwood Capital as part of a debt-for-equity restructuring agreement. The Route 9 property had a renovation crew on site. The Millbrook tax lien was cleared. The business, for the first time in 4 years, was generating a positive cash position. Curtis had retained a lawyer to explore contesting the debt acquisition. There were no grounds. We both knew there were no grounds. But working through it would take time, and sometimes time is what people need. I hung up the phone and walked through the rooms of that house. My grandmother's house, mine now, and thought about what she'd written. She will know what to do with the properties. She had seen something in me long before I had built anything worth seeing. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the legal mechanics of what happened in Mr. Calloway's conference room, but the line in her handwriting on a folded sheet of paper, written sometime in the last months of her life when she knew exactly what she was doing. I made coffee in her kitchen and sat in her chair by the window and watched the January light move across the bare field. Here is what I know, after all of it. The $5,000 check my brother slid across the table was never meant to help me. It was meant to purchase my silence, my compliance, and my correct placement at the bottom of a hierarchy he had spent his whole life arranging. He thought the check was the end of a conversation. He didn't understand that I had spent 6 years building something that made the check not just insulting, but entirely beside the point. Quiet work compounds. The things you construct when no one is paying attention become the most durable things you own. My brother spent 4 years performing success. I spent 6 years building it. When the two things finally met in a conference room on a Thursday morning, only one of them held a deed. The field outside was still and pale. I finished my coffee. I let it be enough. If you've ever built something in silence while someone counted you out, share your story in the comments below. And if you've ever had to protect something you love from someone who underestimated how far you'd go to do it, you already know exactly how this felt. Subscribe to Wolf Revenge for more stories like this one.